It was just another ordinary day in the bustling office of a major corporation. The steady hum of printers, the clicking of keyboards, and the quiet chatter of employees filled the air. The atmosphere felt like business as usual, but for one employee, Chris Williams, today was anything but ordinary. Chris had worked double shifts at the restaurant he managed, a waiter's job by day and a part-time chef by night. He was no stranger to hard work, but today his exhaustion had reached its limit. The weight of his responsibilities had begun to take its toll on him. As he walked through the office, he tried to mask the tiredness in his eyes, but anyone who looked closely could see the strain. He paused by the break room, his stomach growling. The vending machine sat in the corner, its offerings unimpressive, but he was hungry. All he could think about was a meal, a simple one. He had been working so long, running on little more than coffee and the occasional snack. But in that moment, he felt the crushing weight of his reality. It wasn't just about hunger. It was the frustration of working endlessly, barely scraping by, while others seemed to move effortlessly through life. Chris had always tried to make the best of his situation, but today that optimism was hard to hold on to. That's when Chris decided to do something he'd never done before. He had worked under his CEO, Darnell Jenkins, for a while now. Darnell was a man who had made a name for himself, a man who understood the struggles of hard work. They didn't talk much, but Chris had always admired Darnell from a distance. Today, though, Chris sent Darnell a message that would change everything. He typed, "Hey Darnell, I've been working double shifts for the past week. Could you help me out with some food? Anything would be appreciated." It wasn't easy for him to ask. He had always kept his pride intact, but his stomach was reminding him that sometimes survival meant swallowing your pride. He sat there in the break room, waiting, unsure of what would come next. Minutes passed and his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart racing. It was Darnell. "Don't worry, Chris. I got you. Wait by the back exit after your shift. I'll bring something by." The relief that flooded over Chris was overwhelming. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from his boss. But this simple act of kindness had lifted a weight off his shoulders. Darnell didn't just see an employee. He saw a person struggling, someone worthy of help. As the hours of his shift ticked away, Chris felt his exhaustion growing, but there was also a new sense of hope. He had reached out and someone had listened. Finally, the clock struck the hour, and Chris grabbed his coat, heading toward the back exit of the building. He wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a sandwich, maybe a snack. But whatever it was, he knew it would be something more than just food. It would be a gesture, one that could change everything for him. Chris waited outside, pacing in the cool night air. His eyes scanned the parking lot, hoping to spot Darnell. A moment later, he saw the familiar figure of his CEO walking toward him. Darnell had a serious look on his face, his steps purposeful as he approached. Chris stood there, unsure of what to say. He was tired, he was hungry, but more than anything, he felt a sense of gratitude for what Darnell had done. As Darnell came closer, he was holding something in his hands, but it wasn't what Chris had expected. It wasn't just a meal. It wasn't a sandwich or a simple snack. Darnell had something more in his hands, something far more valuable. Darnell stopped in front of Chris and looked him in the eyes. "Chris, this isn't just about food. It's about seeing the bigger picture. You've been working tirelessly, but there's something you need to realize about yourself." Chris furrowed his brows, confused. "What do you mean?" Darnell paused for a moment, looking at Chris with a mix of understanding and something deeper. There was no judgment in his eyes, just empathy. He stepped closer and handed Chris a small box, the kind that someone might give when they want to give more than just food. Chris hesitated, looking down at the box, his mind racing. "Open it," Darnell said quietly. Chris, still confused, carefully lifted the lid. Inside the box was a meal. Sure, but it wasn't just any meal. It was an elaborate homemade dinner, something that felt like it came straight from a five-star restaurant. But what struck Chris even more was the note that accompanied it. The note was simple, but it was the words that were written on it that made him freeze. "Chris, you've got more potential than you know. You've been showing up every day, working hard, but it's time for you to stop asking for help in silence. You're worth more than what you're giving yourself credit for. Your time will come, but first you need to realize that you're not just a worker. You're a leader. I see something in you, something that most people can't see. Take this meal as a small step to what's ahead. You're more than ready. Chris's hand trembled slightly as he held the note. He blinked, trying to process the words. Darnell wasn't just giving him food. He was giving him something even more valuable, a sense of worth, an acknowledgement that Chris was capable of something more than the job he'd been stuck in for so long. Darnell watched him closely, waiting for Chris to say something. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and Chris could barely find the words to respond. He had always worked hard, but he never saw himself as a leader. He had always been the person in the back, unnoticed, grinding away while others moved ahead. But what Darnell was saying, it felt like it was unlocking something inside of him. Why? Chris finally managed to ask, his voice quiet but full of emotion. Why me? Why are you doing this? Darnell smiled gently, as if the answer was simple. Because I've been there. I've been in your shoes. I've struggled, worked multiple jobs, and felt like no one saw me. But I learned something along the way. It's not about how hard you work, it's about how you see yourself. And I see a leader in you, Chris. I see potential, and I want to make sure you don't waste it. Chris felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had never thought of himself as someone with potential. But hearing those words from Darnell, someone he had looked up to, someone in a position of power, made something shift inside of him. It was as if a door had opened in his mind, a door he didn't even know was there. Thank you, Chris said softly, his voice thick with gratitude. I don't know what to say. I've never had someone believe in me like this before. Darnell's smile grew wider. You don't need to say anything. Just know that this is the beginning. I've watched you. I've seen your dedication, your passion, and your hunger to succeed. And I'm giving you a chance to prove it. Not just to me, but to yourself. Chris was speechless, the weight of what Darnell had done for him sinking in. This wasn't just about a meal or a handout. This was about a chance to prove to himself that he could rise above the hardships he'd been facing. It was about believing in himself when no one else did. I'm going to take this seriously, Darnell, Chris said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. I'm going to prove that I can do more than just work hard. I'm going to show you that I can lead. Darnell nodded, his expression serious but kind. I know you will, Chris. I'm here to help, but ultimately, the power is in your hands. Don't let anyone tell you your worth. You define it. With that, Darnell turned and walked back toward his car, leaving Chris standing there in the cool night air, holding the meal, the note, and a newfound sense of purpose. Chris didn't sleep much that night. He stayed up thinking about everything Darnell had said, about how he had been seen, not just as an employee, but as someone with potential, someone worth investing in. He had spent so many years feeling like he was just another face in the crowd, just another worker, just another person trying to get by. But now everything felt different. For the first time in a long time, Chris felt like he had a future, like he had a real chance to rise. The next day, things started to shift for him. He took the first step toward change by going into work with a new mindset. He wasn't just there to do his job. He was there to excel, to learn, and to grow. Every task he did was done with more intention, more focus, and more pride. And it didn't go unnoticed. His coworkers began to see a difference in him. His boss began to take more notice of his work. And Darnell's words echoed in his mind every step of the way. You define your worth. As the weeks went by, Chris's efforts paid off. His performance at work improved, and he soon found himself being given more responsibility. Darnell had believed in him when no one else had, and now it was Chris's turn to believe in himself. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when he questioned himself, but he pushed forward. He remembered the meal, the note, and the man who saw something in him before he saw it in himself. And that made all the difference. As Chris continued on his journey, he never forgot the lesson that Darnell had given him. It wasn't about the job he did or the hours he worked. It was about the belief in himself, the ability to recognize his own worth, and the courage to take control of his future. And when the day finally came, when Chris found himself in a position of leadership, he couldn't help but think back to that night. the night that changed everything. He was no longer the person who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, unnoticed and undervalued. He was the person who would inspire others, just as Darnell had inspired him. Darnell had shown him the power of seeing potential in others, and now Chris would do the same.